Picture this. It's 1957, and you pull up to the local drag strip in your Buick. The Chevy guys are laughing. The Ford crowd is making boat jokes. They're all running small blocks with triple carbs and radical cams, while you're sitting there with what looks like Grandpa's grocery getter. Then the flag drops. Your boat anchor launches like it was shot from a cannon, and by the time those hot rodders figure out what happened, you're already collecting your winnings. This is the story of the Buick Nailhead V8, the most underestimated engine in American hot rodding history. Here's what makes this story so delicious. While Ford and Chevy were fighting for magazine covers with their high-revving small blocks, Buick engineers were quietly building something completely different. They weren't trying to win bench races or impress the tech inspectors. They were solving a specific problem that nobody else even recognized. Buick needed an engine that could move 4,500-pound luxury barges with the smoothness of silk and the urgency of a freight train. What they created accidentally became the street racer's secret weapon, an engine so unusual that competitors literally didn't understand how they were getting beaten. The Nailhead wasn't just different, it was backwards. Everything about it violated the accepted hot rodding wisdom of the era. Small valves when everyone else was going bigger. Long stroke when short stroke was king. Massive torque when everyone was chasing horsepower numbers. The name itself came from those tiny valves. They looked like nail heads compared to the massive dinner plates other manufacturers were installing. Hot rodders initially dismissed it as a truck engine in a passenger car. They had no idea they were looking at one of the most sophisticated pieces of engineering to ever come out of Detroit. To understand why Buick went rogue, we need to travel back to 1953. General Motors had a problem. Cadillac had their legendary V8. Oldsmobile had just launched their rocket engine. Pontiac was developing their own V8. But Buick, GM's premium volume brand, was still running inline eights that traced their roots back to the 1930s. These straight eights were smooth and reliable, but they were also heavy, long, and increasingly outclassed. Buick buyers were successful professionals and small-town aristocracy who wanted modern power with traditional refinement. The engineering team, led by Joseph D. Turley, received clear marching orders: create a V8 that felt like a Buick, not a copycat of everyone else's engines. The development team started with a clean sheet and a different philosophy. Instead of chasing peak horsepower numbers for advertising campaigns, they focused on what they called usable power, the kind you actually felt accelerating onto highways or passing on two-lane roads. They studied how Buick owners actually drove. These weren't kids looking to light up the tires. They were doctors, lawyers, and business owners who wanted effortless acceleration without drama. The engine had to idle like a Swiss watch, pull from basement-low RPMs, and never, ever feel stressed. The first Nailhead appeared in 1953 as a 322 cubic inch V8. The specifications looked modest on paper. 8.5-to-1 compression, 188 horsepower, at 4,000 RPM, 300 pound-feet of torque at 2,400 RPM. But those numbers told only part of the story. The bore was 4.0 inches with a 3.2-inch stroke, under square at a time when everyone else was going over square for higher RPM potential. The real shocker was hiding in the cylinder heads. The intake valves measured just 1.75 inches. The exhausts were a minuscule 1.25 inches. For comparison, a contemporary Chrysler Hemi was running 2.0-inch intakes. Even a basic Chevy small block had 1.94-inch intake valves. But here's where it gets interesting. Those tiny valves weren't a compromise. They were the whole point. Turley's team had discovered something counterintuitive. Small valves with high lift created incredible velocity at low engine speeds. Think of it like putting your thumb over a garden hose. Reducing the opening increases the speed of the flow. At 2,000 RPM, when other engines were still wheezing, the Nailhead's intake charge was screaming into the cylinders at velocities that created natural supercharging. The small valves also allowed for massive ports. While the valves were tiny, the passages feeding them were enormous, some of the largest in the industry. The valve arrangement was equally unusual. Buick engineers placed them vertically in the head, not canted like most V8s. They called it a vertical valve engine, though everyone else just saw those nail-like stems poking straight up and coined the nickname that stuck. This arrangement allowed for a compact combustion chamber with excellent flame propagation. The spark plug sat dead center, equidistant from all edges of the chamber. When that plug fired, the flame front expanded uniformly, creating smooth, complete combustion. The camshaft profile was pure Buick thinking. While other manufacturers were grinding aggressive cams with lots of overlap for top-end power, Buick specified a mild cam with minimal overlap. The intake valve opened late and closed early. The exhaust valve barely cracked before the intake closed. This created massive cylinder pressure at low RPM, but limited high RPM breathing. Buick didn't care. Their customers weren't going to be spinning these engines to 6,000 RPM. They wanted stump-pulling torque from idle to 4,500 RPM, and that's exactly what this combination delivered. By 1957, Buick had evolved the Nailhead to 364 cubic inches. The bore grew to 425 inches, but the stroke remained long at 3.4 inches. Compression jumped to 10.5.1 in the Century and Supermodels. With a 4-barrel carburetor, it produced 300 horsepower at 4,600 RPM and 380 pound-feet of torque at just 2,800 RPM. These weren't just numbers on a dyno sheet. This engine would push a 4,200-pound Roadmaster from 0 to 60 in 8.5 seconds, remarkable for the era. Quarter-mile times dipped into the low 16s at nearly 90 miles per hour. The torque curve was the Nailhead's party trick. Maximum torque arrived at 2,800 RPM, but the engine was already making 90% of peak torque at 1,500 RPM. It held that torque flat as a table until 4,000 RPM. This wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Other engines had peaky torque curves that required constant shifting to stay in the power band. The Nailhead just pulled and pulled and pulled. You could leave a stoplight in second gear and accelerate to highway speeds without touching the shifter. Buick's revolutionary Dynaflow automatic transmission was specifically designed to exploit this torque curve. Unlike conventional automatics with defined gear ratios, the Dynaflow used a torque converter that provided infinite variability within its range. It was essentially a CVT before anyone knew what to call it. The combination of Nailhead torque and Dynaflow smoothness created acceleration that felt like a turbine. No shifts, no interruptions, just seamless thrust. Contemporary road testers described it as taking off in an aircraft. The 1959 model year brought the ultimate evolution, the 401 Nailhead. Bore increased to 4.875 inches, stroke stretched to 3.64 inches. In standard trim, it produced 325 horsepower at 4,400 RPM and 445 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM, but those were conservative factory ratings. Buick deliberately underrated their engines to avoid insurance issues and internal GM politics. Cadillac would have thrown a fit if Buick advertised more power than their premium division. Real-world dyno tests showed the 401 making closer to 360 horsepower and nearly 500 pound-feet of torque. So what was actually going on inside this engine that made it so different? The Nailhead's power came from 3 interconnected design elements working in harmony. First, those small valves and large ports created what engineers call port velocity. At low RPM, the intake charge moved so fast it literally rammed itself into the cylinders, creating natural supercharging without any mechanical assistance. Second, the vertical valve arrangement and central spark plug location created optimal flame propagation. The fuel burned more completely and more quickly than in other designs. Third, the long stroke provided massive mechanical advantage. Each power stroke had more distance to convert expanding gases into rotating force. Think of it this way. A short-stroke engine is like pedaling a bicycle in high gear. You need to spin fast to generate power. A long-stroke engine is like pedaling in low gear. Each stroke generates more leverage. The Nailhead was geared for torque multiplication, not RPM. This is why it could embarrass supposedly faster engines in real-world driving. While a Chevy 283 needed to scream to 5,000 RPM to make power, the Nailhead was already gone, pulled by torque that arrived instantly and never quit. The hot rodders who figured this out first kept their mouths shut. They'd show up at drag strips with what looked like stock Buicks, maybe with subtle modifications nobody would notice. Dual exhausts tucked up high. A camshaft just slightly more aggressive than stock. Nothing radical, just enough to extend the power band another 500 RPM. Maybe a dual-quad intake manifold hiding under a stock air cleaner. The beauty was that the Nailhead didn't need much. Its inherent design was already optimized for the kind of acceleration that won street races. The killing blow came from weight transfer. The Nailhead's instant torque would squat the rear suspension hard, planting the tires while lifting the nose. This weight transfer increased traction dramatically. Meanwhile, the guy in the small block Chevy was spinning his tires trying to get his peaky engine into its power band. By the time he hooked up and started accelerating, the Buick was already 3 car lengths ahead and pulling away. The races were often over before they began. Max Balkowski, the legendary California hot rodder who built the famous Old Yeller race cars, was one of the first to recognize the Nailhead's potential. He started using Buick engines in his road racing specials when everyone else was running Chevys or Chryslers. People thought he was crazy until his Buick-powered cars started beating Ferraris and Maseratis. The secret was that massive mid-range torque. Coming out of corners, while the high-strung European engines were still building revs, the Nailhead was already pulling hard. Balkowski's success opened eyes in the racing community. The Nailhead's most famous moment came courtesy of Mickey Thompson, the speed record pioneer. In 1959, Thompson built his Challenger 1 Streamliner for Bonneville. Everyone expected him to use a blown Chrysler Hemi or a GMC diesel. Instead, he bolted 4 supercharged 401 Nailheads together, creating a 2,070 cubic inch monster, making an estimated 2,800 horsepower. The press was baffled. Why Buicks? Thompson's answer was simple. They make torque everywhere. His faith was rewarded when Challenger 1 became the first American car to exceed 400 miles per hour, hitting 406.60 mph in a one-way run. The drag racing community gradually caught on. The Nailhead had one advantage nobody had considered. It was underestimated. NHRA classified cars by advertised horsepower and weight. Since Buick underrated their engines and the cars were heavy, Nailhead-powered cars often ended up in lower classes where they had a massive real-world power advantage. A properly tuned 401 could destroy the competition in E-stock or D-stock classes where it technically didn't belong. Let me put the 401's torque in perspective. A 1963 Ford 427, the legendary side oiler that dominated NASCAR, made 425 pound-feet of torque at 3,600 RPM. The Buick 401 made more torque 800 RPM sooner. A 1969 Dodge 440 Magnum, one of the torquiest engines of the muscle car era, peaked at 480 pound-feet at 3,200 RPM. The hopped-up 401s built by Buick performance dealers were matching those numbers a full decade earlier. This engine was achieving muscle car performance before the muscle car era officially began. But the Nailhead had weaknesses that eventually sealed its fate. That same port design that created incredible low-speed velocity became a restriction at high RPM. The small valves that work so well at street speeds simply couldn't flow enough air for all-out racing. While a Chevy small block could rev to 7,000 RPM with the right parts, A Nailhead was done by 5,500 RPM no matter what you did to it. The vertical valve arrangement also created problems for radical performance builds. There was no room for larger valves without completely redesigning the heads. The oiling system was the Nailhead's Achilles heel in competition. Buick designed it for smooth street driving, not the sustained high RPMs of racing. The oil pump was undersized, the passages were restrictive, and the rear main bearing was prone to failure under extreme conditions. Hot rodders learned to add external oil coolers, high-volume pumps, and modified oil passages, but it was a band-aid on a fundamental limitation. The Nailhead was a street engine pressed into racing service, and it showed. By 1963, Buick management saw the writing on the wall. The Nailhead's unique architecture made it expensive to manufacture. Those vertical valves required special machining operations. The small combustion chambers limited bore growth. The long stroke created piston speeds that were near the limits of contemporary materials. Other GM divisions had moved to thin-wall casting techniques that reduced weight and cost. The Nailhead's thick castings were from another era. The wider automotive world was changing too. The horsepower race was accelerating. Customers wanted engines that revved to the moon and made impressive peak power numbers for bragging rights. The Nailhead's low-end torque was no longer a selling point when every magazine was publishing top speed runs and peak horsepower comparisons. Buick's traditional buyers were aging, and younger customers wanted something that looked and sounded more aggressive. In 1964, Buick introduced the Ford 25 Nailhead as a last hurrah. Bore grew to 4.325 inches, stroke stretched to 3.64 inches. With dual quads, it made 360 advertised horsepower, though actual output was closer to 400. It was the biggest, most powerful Nailhead ever built. But it was also the end of the line. Development had already begun on a completely new engine family that would debut in 1967. The replacement was the Buick 400, 430, 455 series with modern canted valve heads, bigger ports, and high RPM capability. These engines made more peak power and could be modified more extensively. They were better engines by every objective measure, but they were also ordinary. They revved and breathed like every other big block V8 of the era. The unique character, that tsunami of low-end torque that defined the Nailhead experience, was gone. Today, the Nailhead occupies a strange position in the collector car world. It's not as famous as the Chrysler Hemi or as common as the Chevy small block. Parts are harder to find and more expensive when you do. But those who know, know. A properly built Nailhead is still one of the most satisfying engines to drive on the street. That wall of torque that arrives at idle and never stops pulling creates a driving experience unlike anything else from the era. The specialized knowledge required to build and tune Nailheads has become almost mystical. There are maybe a dozen shops in the country that really understand these engines. They know the tricks, which cam profiles work, how to modify the oiling system, where to add material to strengthen the block. A properly built 401 with modern materials and machining can make 500 horsepower and 600 pound-feet of torque while still idling like a stalker. But it takes a craftsman who understands the Nailhead's unique personality. The Nailhead's influence extended far beyond Buick. It proved that there wasn't just one way to build a performance engine. While everyone else was following the same high RPM formula, Buick showed that massive low-end torque could be just as effective, maybe more so in real-world conditions. Modern turbocharged engines follow a similar philosophy, moderate RPM limits but enormous torque from low revs. The EcoBoost engines that Ford puts in everything from F-150s to GTs are spiritual descendants of the Nailhead concept. Tesla's electric motors take the Nailhead philosophy to its logical extreme, maximum torque from 0 RPM. When car journalists describe the instant thrust of electric vehicles as revolutionary, Buick engineers from the 1950s would probably chuckle. They were delivering that same immediate, seamless acceleration 60 years ago. They just did it with gasoline and mechanical genius instead of batteries and computers. The Nailhead story is really about engineering courage. It would have been easy for Buick to copy Cadillac's approach or follow Oldsmobile's template. Instead, they questioned every assumption about how a V8 should be designed. They ignored conventional wisdom and magazine racers to focus on how their customers actually drove. They built an engine that was wrong by every accepted standard, but absolutely right for its intended purpose. And in doing so, they accidentally created one of the most effective street performance engines ever built. There's something deeply satisfying about the Nailhead legend. In an era of conformity, when every manufacturer was chasing the same numbers, Buick engineers had the confidence to be different. They trusted their calculations and real-world testing over bench racing theories. They built an engine that couldn't win a dyno contest, but would embarrass anything on the street. It's a reminder that in engineering, as in life, there's always more than one path to success. The next time you see a 1950s or early 1960s Buick at a car show, don't dismiss it as a grandmother's car. Pop the hood and look for those distinctive vertical valve covers. If you see them, you're looking at one of Detroit's most misunderstood masterpieces, an engine that broke all the rules and beat all the favorites, an engine that proved torque beats horsepower every time, at least on the street where it counts. The boat anchor that sank the competition. What's the most underrated engine you've ever experienced? The sleeper that nobody saw coming? Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Detroit's most unlikely hero, make sure to subscribe because we're just getting started exploring the engineering marvels that changed the automotive world.